Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry for the slight delay that we've had while we sort out some tech issues. So thank you very much for bearing with us. My name is Kay Mitchell. I'm the director of the Centre for New Writing. And it gives me enormous pleasure to kick off this second series of novel voices. This is an event that we're running with Creative Manchester and also with our partners Blackwell's. So thank you to them for their support. The Novel Voices series features Ellah P. Wakatama, who is a renowned editor, publisher, prize judge, and also a senior research fellow at the Centre for New Writing. Ellah in conversation with debut authors about their craft and about the journey that they went on to producing this first sort of body of work. And the works that will be discussed in this series span genres as the series seeks to explore a range of narratives that reflect the new voices that haven't been and that will be shaping the literary landscape of 2021. And if you want an indication of Ellah's success at spotting who the authors are that we should be watching, then Natasha Brown, who was one of the featured authors last year for her extraordinary novel Assembly, has recently been shortlisted for the Goldsmiths Prize, something that we're absolutely delighted about. She's also going to be joining us in the spring as one of our fellows at the Centre for New Writing. Tonight's guest, we're delighted to announce, is Heba Hayek, whose novel Sandbach Beneath Unlikely Skies was published by Hajjal Press in July 2021, described as a tender yet brutal novel about a girlhood in Gaza, filled with honey and warmth. So I'm going to hand over to Ellah and to Heba now for their conversation. And I will just add that if you have any questions while they're talking, do put your questions using the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Put your questions in there and they'll be very happy to respond to your questions at the end. And at the end, I'll also tell you about the other events that we have coming up in this series, but I won't delay their discussion any further.
Hey, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's so wonderful to welcome you all back to the Novel Voices series. And yes, we're really pleased with how well the first cohort did. No pressure, Heba. But I'm so excited to meet you. Let me do a brief introduction. Heba Hayek now lives in London. She was born and raised in Gaza, Palestine. She is a graduate of the MFA program in creative writing at Miami University, Ohio. I didn't even know there was a Miami University in Ohio.
It's a long story.
It's a long story. And is studying for an MA in social anthropology at SOAS University of London. Heba, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's an honor.
I also want to just start off and say a little bit about this year's Novel Voices series. As with last year, we'll be spanning a whole range of genres and subjects and places, as Kay said. And I hope you'll all join me next week on November the 8th, when I'll be speaking with the American writer Micaiah Johnson about her new novel, which is a science fiction novel about the multiverse, literally another world. Or other worlds, rather, from where we are today. But today we are with Heba and we're discussing your book, which is this wonderful sort of witness document that has been put together about the state of girlhood in Gaza as you're growing up. And Heba, I want us to start by talking, first of all, a little bit about the subject matter before we then go to focus in about your journey towards writing this book. One of the things that I really loved about the book was there's a chapter that's titled Chronology of a Girlhood in Gaza, in which you almost give very short bullet points of different points in life. And I thought that was extraordinary because actually the whole book could be called The Chronology of Girlhood in Gaza, because there's so many little stories about everyday life. What you're writing about is a place in the world that many people think of as, and you say this yourself in the book, as uninhabitable. And what your book did for me was to show me how people actually lived in this place. Why was it really important for you to focus in on the very daily domestic lives of women?
First of all, am I not reading excerpts?
You will during the course of the
Okay.
conversation. Don't
Amazing.
worry. Yes.
I thought I was starting with them, but
Sorry.
incredible. Yeah, I'm asked often about the normalcy and the symbol language that exist and like appear in the narrative. And I think the reason why I needed to take myself back, as well as my reader with me, to these moments that I have witnessed as a child, or my character has witnessed as a child, is because basically of the paradoxes that I have felt since I moved from Gaza to the United States and then London. Back home was the familiar and the thing that I've known about the world. And even in war, people manage to find normalcy and manage to find joy and enjoyment and indulgence in matters that are not necessarily a victimhood, or like a struggle, or fighting against war and all of that. So I think when I came here after living a normal life, like many children live in Gaza, and coming to the West and seeing the narrative that has been created around what Palestine is, and what a woman from Palestine is as well, and what feminized people from Palestine look like and act like, and what kind of safety they need. I realized that it took me a while to accept that, to see. I've known since I was a child that the outside world doesn't like Palestine so much, but coming here and then seeing the entire narrative and how it was washed was a bit of a shock for me, and was a bit of a harder thing to come to terms with than even the cultural shock itself, because I was just watching Hollywood growing up, watching American movies. I thought that I know what society I'm moving into, so that was not really the hard part. It was just reckoning with the monstrosity that is created around my struggle for freedom, and villainizing that struggle that I identify with very strongly. So I felt that I wanted to talk about home the way I know it. And through that, I wanted to enjoy writing about it. And I think like it is, it's very surprising for people to see these normal moments, as if violence is the only thing that occurs in areas where war is happening, or war is happening. And that's not that was not my experience. So
Yes.
yeah, I wanted to bring that, and to also like, I find it very ridiculous sometimes, because violence exists in these countries as well. It's just the way slow death work, and the way we're washed under the systems and capitalism and whiteness is very, very different from the death that's happening back home. But people speak about normalcy in such a surprising way, as if it shouldn't exist back home and it should exist here. I think there's war everywhere, there's war outside, and there's also normalcy.
I think because you're discussing home and what home means. I mean, there's a lot in here about food and flowers and smells and those comforts of home. And I thought myself about how people, I'm from Zimbabwe, and people will often say, well, are your parents still there? Is it safe to go? And I think, well,
Yeah.
my parents and my cousins live their daily lives there. There's a point towards the end where you say, during war is the least of our concerns. And that really struck me, because I first wanted to argue with you. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, actually, people do go around, they're still worrying about, bread to feed their families, and little girls are still casting shy glances at, people that they have a crush on and so on. Did you feel when you moved to England that you didn't recognize yourself in the way that we, as in, this literary culture tells the story of Palestine? Is that what you mean, that you didn't know who they were talking about, therefore you wanted to write what you felt was true?
I think like that is definitely the case. Like, it is definitely not seeing myself or the familiarity that I have grown up into, and I know reflected in the way people speak about Palestine here. And I have, even though, despite the fact that I have early in my childhood recognized how the world treats Palestine, as I said earlier, or like looks at Palestine, and that it's like complicated and conflict and all of that stuff, it was still really surprising. And I think like the need for normalcy and even simple writing, if you notice, the narrative is really simple, the writing is could easily be called very simple and clear.
It's very accessible rather than simple. Yes,
I didn't feel like I needed that extravagant sort of like villain versus hero kind of narrative in my writing, because I know they know what I would say, like we know who the villain is, and we know that exists, but at the same time what I needed to create is sort of like an experience, a moment of honesty and conversation with my reader as I speak about home. And that's why I think like when it comes to the senses and the way senses are being used, I think that in a lot of ways creates a lot of relatability when readers are reading my book, as in it's stuff that you've also experienced: crushes, love letters, sitting with aunties, being
crazy grandmothers.
that stuff. Yeah, literally.
But that very domesticity that we're talking about, and that centering of girls and women is really evident. And it's it's a slim volume. I know you can't see very well on this, but for me it was packed with life. I felt I'd lived lots of different lives. Let's talk a little bit about putting the book together. And I'd also like to talk about some of the decisions you made around structure. It's interesting to me that you'd call the writing or the language simple. To me, it wasn't simple. It was very accessible. I felt very welcomed into the story. And as you say, there was lots that I could respond to. In your author's note, you talk about being overwhelmed by the sense of urgency because you wanted to collect together these stories and find, your words are, I wanted to find relatability and home in a world that constantly reminds us of our foreignness, which I found very meaningful, and it did stick with me. Tell us when this book first came about. Like, how did you first start thinking this was a way that you could, I guess, answer the question that you were asking yourself about that kind of sense of home and relatability?
I've never started writing with that end goal of with a book as an end goal necessarily. I started writing at a very young age, and then I went to do the MFA, and then the MFA there was a lot of focus on publishing, and they would get us to meet with Asians, and like a part of the syllabi that we were receiving in our workshops was to actually submit for publications, and I just never did any of this stuff. Like, I could not feel like safe or comfortable enough and sharing my stories for the longest time of my life.
Tell us a little bit about feeling safe and comfortable. The reason I do want to delve into it a little bit is because I think it's really important for people who feel they're writing out of a place to redress the way something has been written. It can be quite frightening. What was uncomfortable and what was frightening for you?
Absolutely. I think like writing about something that is still happening, that is not treated as a memory or as a historical story or fact, is a very vulnerable and sometimes really like painful thing to do. And writing for me, like I first and foremost write for enjoyment. For me, it's really addictive how it feels when a story or like I watch a scene or a story form in front of me. It's just like another way of seeing the world, I think. And I do it for that reason before anything else. So I think like the instant feeling that I have experienced when I met the other woman from Gaza in the United States. I'll tell the story. So basically, I will tie that again to the fear. So just bear with me. So basically, I moved to the States in 2017 to do my MFA. It was the first time for me to live outside home. Grew up there 23 years. And when I went to the States, it was really shocking for me how inaccessible home is for me. Like, one of the things I always thought about is that when I was back home and I would dream about, traveling and seeing the world, I would just like type videos on YouTube and see what's going on and like see beaches of Hawaii and all of these places. And And it was very accessible. The world is the way it exists in a way, not fully, but is available online. But Gaza is not. Like, if I look up Gaza, if I write Gaza Beach, if I write Gaza, if I write Palestine, there will always be talk about conflict. And that's that. I'm not to say that we shouldn't be talking about that, but at the same time, like, I felt so much erasure. What in my first few, like, I recognize with the erasure that's happening in my first few months in Ohio. It is a bit of an extreme place to be right outside from Gaza, but at the same time, I think that erasure exists in different forms, even in London, obviously. So seeing the erasure and seeing how much I'm not seen as a Palestinian person, and how like just unacceptable in a way it is for me to be loud there about who I am, in a very conservative, white, like almost like majority of Trump supporters spaces. It was too much. Like, it was hard, even though it's the reality of the world, to be able to reckon with that. And then I was like, okay, I need to find people who are like me, people who speak like me, people who are, is everyone who left home feeling what I'm feeling right now? Am I alone in this? And so many of my friends had left already, and it's been that time was just like the height of people leaving. And Gaza is small, so we all know each other. And I managed to, through finding little deals on buses and flights, to go into a trip for almost a week to visit 5 women from Gaza who ended up mostly in the Midwest and New York, in the States. And I spent days with them because I was considering writing autoethnography. I was considering anthropology before I really was writing for more like fiction and novel and creative writing. And I met them, and we spent days together and chatted and cooked together. And I realized in these conversations how like the narrative we have is not linear. We don't have the same story. We don't have the same experiences, the same even worries. We share a lot of them, but it's not one story. And then I recognize that as much as I identify with these women and I see what they've been through, we all have these different stories. And I felt like it is not, I'm not saying it's my responsibility, but there was urgency in the sense of like, I want to tell those stories. Like, I'm sitting with my friend here and she's telling me the story of how she left, and then other friend is talking to me about her grandma and all of these stuff. Like, it's just very yeah. So like I ended up so the idea of Sambak came from that recognition of not having one memory or one linear story. And then I went through the whole MFA being really scared to get published. And then my professor, Daisy Hernandez, an amazing professor, queer professor in Miami University, has talked to me about it. And she was like, you know what, you just submit to Daisy's journal and just put that in your, like, you know, like, you don't have to be submitting for publications if you're not ready. I will be your publication. And I started doing that, which was really amazing. And then through that, I slowly started to realize how powerful it is for me to be able to share that truth with people beyond me and my community. And the fear was very apparent in that moment, because it's really scared to be very seen and very vulnerable in front of a majority of readers that you don't know or have not interacted with, and even with people who have known you before. So but
there's a point in your book where the character's riding in a taxi and is very afraid of how the taxi driver will respond when she says where she's from. And that it's a very short scene, but to me, it spoke volumes. I don't know if you remember where the taxi driver then says, "I'm with your people." And part of me exhaled at that point. And I think that the fear you're speaking about sounds, you know, it makes sense to me because of what I've read. You manage very skillfully to weave these stories together so the reader is presented with a coherent narrative. We feel as if we're reading one life, and it's certainly not autobiographical. But even beyond that, I felt that I could secretly sneak a little chapter in from my life or someone else's life, and it would be lives of women all around the world. For me, that was magical. Heba, I think it's a great point for us to have the first reading now so the audience can hear it.
Amazing.
Give us a little bit of context so we know where you're reading from. And
so the first, like, something that I would like to read right now is basically like the first half of a vignette called Ask Me Anything. This vignette is, as all other vignettes, is attached to a song called Yagamar. It's a very nostalgic love song, but it's like sort of like platonic love letter. More like my mom sent it to me just to tell me that I'm not calling her enough, and I was like, yeah. Yeah, so I'll read the first half of Ask Me Anything. And just a little bit of context, it is basically about being like hiding under the bench while escalations were happening in elementary school. We were never trained for emergencies at school. We just knew what to do. We would sit on the floor under our tables each time we heard the recurrent loud explosions, ignore the first two, exchange a few nervous looks, and then, in a one swift move, we'd all be in our places by the third. That consistency was comforting. The fact that we had survived the first two was a good enough sign that it'd be worth shielding ourselves from the rest. In an attempt at reassurance, our teacher would remind the class, the one you hear isn't the one that kills you. On particularly bad days, she'd allow us to choose our bench partners. We should always sit at the table in the middle of the classroom, Lubna observed. This way, we'll be safe if the bombs fall on either sides of the classroom. What if they come through the ceiling? They don't. I don't think that's possible. Lubna said things very convincingly, but sometimes she was simply bullshitting me. Even then, her intentions were always to make me feel better. Yeah, I don't think their weapons are strong enough to go through the ceiling, I commented, in what was half a statement and half a question. Totally, Lubna replied. Most days we would spend around 10 minutes under the tables until local radios confirmed what was going on. It was always a disappointment if class resumed, but only because we never let ourselves consider the other outcome. Being sent home while providing the immediate pleasure of missing school was never a good sign. Those 10 minutes were ours. They felt sacred, as if bombs couldn't reach or interrupt us, as if the whole world, including the European soldier controlling the war plans from an office, had stopped and were counting the seconds with us. We tried creating routines that would help us to adapt. Most girls cross-clapped or told riddles. Some would space out in the dusty light that burst through the windows, light that possessed all of the world and all of its possibilities. Ask me anything, Lubna whispered. Anything like what? We stared at each other for a few seconds as it dawned on us. We had found our emergency ritual, a question game that would only play under the benches. In these moments, we'd reveal to each other which areas of our bodies had grown new hair, how to change the shower pressure, and what counts as fasting during Ramadan. We agreed that accidentally drinking water while washing our faces was simply unavoidable. It was Lubna's turn. How does it feel to kiss someone? I once tried to kiss myself, I said. You idiot. I kissed myself on my shoulder, but it left a huge red marks. Do you think I was being punished? I sucked the soft part of my arm to show her. Our laughs emanated from our chests and filled the air. That's so awful. That's it.
Thank you so much, Heba. I love the nonsense of girlhood amidst bombs falling and this idea that the bombs would be strong enough to sort of get through the ceiling. And later on, there's a scene in which I think a grandmother's house is partially destroyed. And it's the same thing with that feeling of you try and put all of these things in place. Like if you have a game to play or a ritual, then you'll be safe. But actually, it's out of your hands. I want to come back later to that idea of what childhood is like in that situation. But one of the things that struck me is that for me, reading through the novel, and I read it in one sitting, and there's a real coherent narrative voice. But as you describe the genesis of the story, you're visiting different people and collecting conversation and so on. What did you have to do as a writer? Can we talk a little bit about the crafting of it? Once you'd heard all of those stories, what did you do as a writer to take all those different voices and to create one very convincing and kind of authentic narrative whole?
I tell that story as the origin of Sambak, but not what Sambak resulted. Like, that story was basically me thinking that anthropology is the only way I can participate in the creation of narrative and documentation of a place that is not documented well enough, or where its indigenous people are not writing about it enough. I'm referring to Gaza and Palestine. And that's not how the project ended in any way. I think one of the biggest processes and learning curves of my life that I will continue to learn is that I'm not a walking anthropological project or observation. Anthropology is not the only way for me to exist, because it's, for people like me, I already have the exotic story. I already have the wild, nights of bombardments and war and all of the sauce publishers need. And I had to, but I always loved writing, and I loved art and in its timelessness and in the way it works with memory as well. And I wanted to allow myself to imagine as I wrote, because I couldn't bring myself to interviewing my mom or my grandma and demanding truth from them about events that happened. The way Sambak was born through these meetings with these women was more about finding familiarity and finding a way for me to sort of find the logic of us existing outside home, because it felt for a while like, with the level of erasure I was feeling and the invisibility I was feeling in Ohio, I needed to sort of binge myself a bit through seeing myself through others. And it was really beautiful to do that. But that could be a whole other project. Sambak was mostly a tale of my own childhood. And I chose autofiction because I wanted, first of all, to stop looking at myself as an anthropological project, which is, again, how the world usually looks at me, and to even lose, as Toni Morrison says, lose the white gaze in my imagination. I did not want to feel like I had to write for the purpose of publishing and then for the purpose of Western or English speaking readers to observe me and absorb me in a way that's accessible for them and acceptable. So going through all of that process, I started to let myself move away from nonfiction, and I wrote an autofictional book. So I didn't really go that far, but I think the first permission that I've given myself in Sambak, which Sambak has ended up is now a witness to that, is the permission to let myself imagine some of the events. Because even in the story, if you notice, in one of the stories, in Airplanes to Nowhere, I had as a child entirely different memory and understanding of what my auntie was doing outside Gaza. I thought she was married and living, all that like wonderful, extravagant life outside Gaza, but she was literally sent away because of her politics. So
I'm sorry, Heba, please
go
finish.
ahead. Yeah. I was just saying that I wanted to have that same grace with imagination that my childhood self had, because I've heard once a story that, or like an advice for parents, that when your child comes to you and like tells you that someone stole the ball and someone did not steal the ball, the child must be telling you something else about the person, that the child is not feeling safe around the person, or the child thinks the person is not good, or all of that stuff. So you should believe what the imagination created, and that giving that grace to my child self to be able to imagine and indulge and have these moments of mostly meditation with these scenes and experiences and memories rather than fact checking was my first permission to myself to become or to be a writer who is not an anthropological project only.
That's really important. There's so many things you're navigating there, and I like the way you describe them as vignettes and even more so as meditations, because each chapter seems to me to be an important meditation on something. Before I turn to talking about the women, and I want to talk about the aunt a little bit, tell us about the playlist that goes with the book.
I owe that in a lot of ways to Hazard Press. So I've always thought about it, and I truly can't remember who started the conversation about a playlist, but I think they did. I think they said that we would like to attach playlists. And then I was like, this is exactly what I wanted to do. So I don't know who came with it first, but I owe it to Hazard Press for having such beautiful grace about an openness about letting me sort of play with the playlist however I want it. So I wanted to attach each vignette to a playlist, not only add a playlist to the book. And I think I really appreciate stories that are also told through like sound and music, and all different ways art is sort of like manifesting in our lives right now. And I'm just really excited about like the artists who are like singers, songwriters, hip hop artists, like rappers from Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, that are coming up right now and creating all of this beautiful like ways of us of being heard and being like letting people participate in who in whatever stories we want to be, but in a different form. So I wanted that to be also a part of Sandbag.
It's rather wonderful. I did find myself distracted when I downloaded one of the songs, and
yeah,
I was remembering an evening where I was somewhere and music was playing and I had no idea what it was, and the DJ said it was Syrian hip hop. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Why didn't anyone tell me? And I think there's another discovery that you give your readers. Let's move a little bit to talk about the women in the book. You were describing just now you're describing a chapter in which an aunt comes from Kuwait. The story the family has told is that she went off to get married. But as you say, you find the truth is very, very different. And I also want to tie that to, I think it's City, a grandmother who is described throughout, over across several meditations. I really loved her. I think many of us who had grandmothers who were a little bit not very nice and also a little bit scary, but still quite loving. I recognized her because my grandmother too was really similar. And just for readers to know that, the book is dealing with quite difficult subjects, but there are moments of lightness and humor that I really treasured. And one is when you discover that the grandmother has been dosing herself with herbal medicine, with moringa, and it's making her completely high. So she's permanently high. And then also red ginseng, which has an effect on the libido. And I thought that was hilarious. And what struck me though with both women is that you describe their resistance effort. You describe them also as part of a resistance movement, I guess. But at the same time, as a reader, and I think this really speaks to what you said at the beginning of our conversation, as a reader, it occurred to me that as widely as I read, I had not read about Gaza before with women at the center. I had not thought of women being involved beyond the women we see covered, sheltering children or whatever else. To me, that felt really important. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you wanted to do with particularly those two characters, because they were fascinating to me.
Yeah. It's exactly how you described it. A bit scary, not very nice, but still have so much love around them. And especially my grandma. It's been a process learning how to relate to my grandma after leaving home, because at home it wasn't inevitable. Like, your grandma's there, you have to respect her, you have to love her, you have to go and say hi, even if you don't like it. And that was fine. It wasn't bad or anything, but I think like it is, I'm taking it a bit personally. If you scroll through TikTok or something like that, you will find a lot of jokes about immigrant moms and about aunties, yes. And then there's this like challenge that's coming up where they like lie to like make up a story about their aunties or grandmas. And I'm starting to take that a little bit personally, because I just like I miss narrative around motherhood and meetings of like femme people and feminized people together in one space that is not only a way to say that they're like breaking us. Like the thing is, there's a lot that's haunting us. There's generations of pain and disposition, and there is men feeling emasculated for not being able to provide or save their families, and mothers and aunties stuck in circles of horrific and abusive patriarchy, from the dad's house to the husband's house, and then to raising children. And that, I acknowledge all of that and I see it fully, and I don't think I'm not denying it in any way, even though I could be accused of over romanticizing my aunties and my grandma. But I think, like, in a lot of ways, as I said before, Sambak was a moment of enjoyment for myself too, of indulging for me too as well, in language and memories. And I see a lot of myself in them the more I grow up, and I saw them breaking cycles before, and I feel like it is also my responsibility to be able to break some of these cycles. And it's almost inevitable that the disappointment and the hurt will come. Like, there's this constant tension between second generation and immigrant families, or like as I am first generation immigrant with my family back home. There's that tension that always exists, and then there is that, again, almost inevitable disappointment. But I think that disappointment is always, even if it happens, it's always in the way I have experienced it, is coming from places of love and fear and of exhaustion of having to break cycles, because me being here is breaking a cycle to begin with. And I felt like again, not to say that I owed it to them, but I felt like I even, maybe to myself, that I allow myself to see them and to write about them in these spaces where nobody really gets in. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're waxing spaces together when we're,
There's that whole wonderful chapter which is all about sort of the removal of body hair in community with other women. Heba, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was about, you were talking about how Hajra Press allowed you to feel confident and to give yourself permission for all of these things. A lot of the audience will be fellow students and aspiring writers. And certainly when we're looking at novel voices, I really wanted to look at small presses, because that's where you find stories that aren't that are not mainstreamed, as it were. And so your book was a wonderful find, and exactly what I was after. Tell us why a small press felt safer for you, and a little bit about what the experience of being published by Hajra Press was.
Yeah. So until Hajra Press and I found each other in a way.
You make it sound like a love affair. That's wonderful.
It is. This is how it feels, because it's a really like lovely story that I don't think we have the full time to tell it, but I think like until I have found myself in this space, and even like just being able to embrace the fact that I could share my work without having to feel the fear and the anxiety and all of that stuff, it was really beautiful to experience that with them, because mainly because of their message, like because of the way they speak about publishing. They have major criticisms of mainstream publishing, and they understand them, and I was able to experience that firsthand. I didn't have I was scared in terms of like perception and of being perceived, but in the editorial process, I have not experienced any of the, again, fears that I've had before about the publishing industry, which is people trying to mold my narrative so that it is more again, like attractive and exotic for the English reader or the white reader. And Hajra Press's commitment to people of color and writing by people of color as well, even the staff being people of color, mostly femme people, just provided that space of like safety and centering and grace, where I could really share raw material with them, and for them to help me get it to a nice shape, so that without any pressure to tell more if I don't need to tell more. Because one of the biggest reasons why I ended up writing vignettes is the sort of like accessibility of it, being able to exit
Yes,
early enough before I break into details, which I could break into details easily, but I'm still learning.
There is that focus, and there is that sort of very carefully crafted form that I think for a reader is unusual and very appealing. You were talking about indulging yourself earlier. I want you to indulge us a little bit more, and could we have your second reading, please?
Oh, absolutely. My second reading is the second half of Oh, How I Missed You. And I chose this because it kind of like is a transition sort of excerpt from being home to traveling, since the first one was about being home. So it's basically from page 116, like 2 pages. Soon you will leave too, Mama lamented. Not like this, I replied. Sometimes I would hear people use wars instead of years to refer to time. I bought this pair of shoes before the first war, or I graduated right after the last war. Stand-ins for 2008 and 2014. Time wasn't linear anymore. It was measured through loss and grief. Amorami's trip was a few years after the last war, when he had stayed with us for a few months while waiting for his family's house to be rebuilt. Already fixated on immigration. Back then, my mother had sometimes slept in the living room by the door, perhaps guarding it, afraid he wouldn't say goodbye. Last night, he had dropped Lean off and told us that he had finally found someone to sneak him out, and that once he's arrived in Malta, he would start working and sending money until he could take the rest of his family too. Don't worry about me. This is the right thing to do, he had said, as if to reassure himself. Allah ma'ak. My parents and I had been the only ones awake to say goodbye. Lean was ready for a solid food and for life. A few days later, a boat carrying 500 migrants across the Mediterranean was hijacked and deliberately sunk off the coast of Malta. Most of the passengers were feared to have drowned. My eyes rest on the scene outside the window, following the dashing buildings and colorless sky, feeling the pressure between the asphalt and the hot tires before the engines release a giant sigh and begin to absorb the heat. The quiet sunrise is reflected in the small foggy windows of the plane. People start unbuckling their seatbelts as the aircraft slowly settles on the runway. I remain seated and wait for others to get their bags from the overhead cabins before my turn comes. I have recently moved on my 8th home since leaving Gaza, not counting friends' sofas and my old office. As I near the expiration of my student visa in London, a friend suggests that I apply for a job in the Netherlands before I risk getting deported. I tell him that I've finally bought my own set of plates and utensils, and that I am no longer moving. For too long, I have feared settling down anywhere, so that I can blame my eternal sense of being out of place on my constant movement. My younger brother appears in the distance as I walk toward the baggage claim in Dusseldorf Airport. The sweet child with whom I'd searched the sky for destinations in the big world is now picking me up from airports. I have been trying to visit him for 4 years. In a small Belgian town, we visit Siti and Ammu Rami, whom we managed to locate 6 months after he disappeared. Lean is 9, all weaned now. Rama is nearly 17 and has slowly been able to untie her tongue. There's an infinite quality to loss, one that caters to our grief as long as we breathe. But there are also moments of contentment, when we let go of grief's gravity and feel as if we had been transported into a quiet place. We take a key from under a rug that leads to a small cottage, wrap our arms around each other, and sit by the fire. In our many displacements, we are constantly searching for that quiet place. I watch my family gather around the table again, plates clinking, kids teething, prayers being read. Oh, how I missed home. Thank you.
Heba, thank you so much. Unbelievably, we are out of time. And
It did pass really quickly.
There was so much more I wanted to talk to you about, but thank you so much for that reading and for telling us about sort of your journey to publication. I do want to say that your book for me is a really important witness to the state of dislocation, but also your goal of showing us in a very beautiful and accessible way, crafted way, that the lives of women that I think many of us will recognize, but also things that will come as a surprise. And to those who have not yet had the pleasure of reading Heba's book, I want to tell you that there are things in there about the Kardashians, if you're into that. And there are also sort of some nice recipes, and you can learn how to make waxing sugar, as well as much bigger political events. And I very much appreciate the way you've been able to give context so that I won't ever open the newspaper and read about Gaza without thinking about the women in your book. Heba, thank you so much for a wonderful book and for the chance to speak with you. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you so much, Heba and Ellah. That was just an absolutely fascinating discussion. And yeah, I feel like we could sort of expand it for hours. Please do look in the chat, people, and you will see a link where you can buy the book. Please just go and buy it now from the press. It's also really good to support small presses. I'm always encouraging people to do that. I just have to remind you before we finish that there are 3 more regular events happening in this series. Micaiah Johnson will be in conversation with Ellah on the 8th of November. Nicola Garrard plus her editor will be in conversation with Ellah on the 22nd of November, and Femi Kayode will be in conversation with Ellah on the 6th of December. In addition, Ellah's event with Caleb Azuma Nelson will be online as part of Manchester Literature Festival, their digital festival that they have going on. I think the in-person festival is now finished, and that will be available to stream and watch between the 1st and 14th of November. Thank you so much again for this discussion, which I think is has been so sort of eye-opening and moving, and it feels like a really important book. So I'm really glad that we're able to give it some attention. And thank you so much for joining us, Heba, and thank you, Ellah, for your
Thank you so much.